Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding stood in his office at RAF Bentley Priory on a warm June morning in 1940, reading yet another memo questioning his ability to lead. At 58, he had become the subject of whispers in Whitehall and pointed remarks at Air Ministry meetings. The criticism was clear. Britain was facing a deadly threat from the Luftwaffe, and some senior officers believed the nation's defense was in the hands of a man too old for the job. The timing for such doubts could not have been worse. France had fallen quickly, signing an armistice on June 22, 1940, leaving Britain completely alone against Nazi Germany. Across the Channel, the Luftwaffe had perfected its blitzkrieg tactics, wiping out the Polish Air Force in days and the French Armée de l'Air in weeks. Hermann Göring now commanded nearly 2,800 aircraft, flown by battle-hardened pilots fresh from conquering Western Europe. In contrast, Fighter Command could muster only about 640 fighters. Leading this outnumbered force was a grey-haired officer critics mockingly called Stuffy, a nickname that captured what they thought of his strict, methodical ways. The Air Ministry's doubts were not entirely baseless. Modern air combat had changed beyond recognition since Dowding first flew in the Great War. In 1940, battles were fought at 350 metissims, far faster than the old RFC biplanes. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 could reach 30,000 feet in minutes. Radios, radar, and large coordinated formations had revolutionized warfare. Many believed this new age needed younger men, officers in their 40s who had grown up with modern technology and understood it naturally. Dowding's retirement had already been delayed twice, first set for June 1939, then extended to March 1940, and again to October 1940. Each extension seemed less like trust and more like hesitation, as though the Air Ministry feared replacing him in the middle of a crisis. Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, commander of 12 Group, made no secret of wanting Dowding's job. At 48, he was energetic and pushed for bold big-wing tactics that sounded daring next to Dowding's cautious planning. Yet what critics failed to see was that Dowding's so-called outdated methods were his greatest strength. While younger men dreamed of glory and dogfights over France, Dowding had quietly spent 5 years building something revolutionary, an integrated air defense system, combining fighters, radar observers and operations rooms into one coordinated weapon. It wasn't glamorous work. It meant endless meetings about telephone lines, maps, and radio networks, the kind of dull details that bored others. But Dowding had two vital traits that mattered more than youth. He knew Britain couldn't outfight Germany by numbers. It had to fight smarter, and he had an unshakable will to stand firm when he knew he was right. In May 1940, as France collapsed, Churchill and the War Cabinet demanded that he send more fighters to France. Dowding refused, writing bluntly that draining Fighter Command would doom Britain. The decision angered Churchill but saved the RAF. Now, in the summer of 1940, all his preparation would be tested. The foundation of his strategy had been laid 5 years earlier, when most RAF officers dismissed radar as a laboratory fantasy. In February 1935, Robert Watson Watt had proved radio waves could detect aircraft by bouncing signals off a bomber 8 miles away at Daventry. The Air Ministry's reaction was lukewarm. Radio detection seemed clever in theory, but unreliable for war. Weather could disrupt it, enemy jamming could blind it, and maintaining such systems across the coast seemed impossible. Dowding disagreed. As Air Member for Supply and Research in 1930, and later the first commander of Fighter Command in July 1936, he recognized radar's potential to fix Britain's biggest weakness, lack of warning time. German bombers could cross the Channel in 20 minutes. Without early detection, fighters would still be grounded when bombs fell. Radar offered a way to see raids forming over France, and gave 30 to 40 vital minutes to launch fighters. But Dowding envisioned more than early warning. He wanted a live, complete picture of every aircraft for hundreds of miles. This meant linking multiple systems and teams into one network. Chain-home radar stations would spot incoming raids from afar, The Observer Corps, 30,000 civilian volunteers armed with binoculars, maps, and tables, would track aircraft movements and feed data to control centers. Telephones tracked enemy planes once they crossed the coast and moved beyond radar coverage. All this information flowed into filter rooms, where trained plotters separated real aircraft from false signals, then passed confirmed tracks to Fighter Command's operations room at Bentley Priory. From there, the data moved down through group operations centers to sector stations, where controllers could see both friendly and enemy aircraft displayed on large map tables. These controllers directed fighters by radio, guiding them toward their targets with constantly updated information. The entire system worked through what Dowding called a continuous flow of information, moving seamlessly from radar tower to pilot's headset in less than 4 minutes. The technical hurdles were huge. Each chain home station required steel towers 350 feet tall and cost about $15,000 to build. By September 1939, 20 stations stretched from Southampton to Newcastle, and Dowding had fought fiercely for every pound of funding against critics who argued that money should go to building more planes. The radar units themselves were delicate. Valves often failed in the coastal humidity. Operators took months to master the fuzzy green blips on their screens, and early sets couldn't measure altitude accurately. Dowding tackled the altitude problem through pure persistence. Since chain home couldn't reliably gauge height, he ordered the creation of chain home low stations that used shorter wavelengths to spot low-flying aircraft, though at a reduced range. He also demanded that every radar post be linked to its operations center through dedicated GPO telephone lines, with backup routes in case bombs cut the main ones. When Treasury officials objected to the costs, Dowding simply kept submitting requests until they gave in. Integrating the Observer Corps was just as difficult. These civilian volunteers, many former Great War soldiers, had been tracking aircraft by sight and sound since 1925, but they had never been part of a single coordinated network. Dowding personally visited observation posts to explain how their reports would be combined with radar data to maintain uninterrupted coverage. He created strict training standards and uniform reporting methods so that a message from Kent looked exactly like one from Yorkshire. What resulted was a truly groundbreaking system, the world's first ground-controlled interception network, where fighters were guided remotely by controllers viewing an electronic battlefield. To understand how Dowding's system worked, imagine one German bomber leaving its base in northern France. That single aircraft's flight toward England would trigger a perfectly timed chain of reactions, each step passing information along until it led to an interception. The first alert came from the chain home radar sites lining the coast. These weren't spinning dishes like modern radar, but static wire arrays stretched between giant steel masts that sent bursts of radio energy across the channel. When the signal hit a plane, a small portion bounced back. Operators sitting in dark bunkers and staring at cathode ray screens would see a sharp spike of light. By measuring the time between the sent and returned pulse, since radio waves travel at 186,000 miles per second, they could calculate distance. Comparing signals from multiple towers gave the bearing, while the height was only roughly estimated from the vertical trace on the screen, chain home's constant weakness. The radar operator would then phone the filter room at Fighter Command headquarters. This step was crucial because raw radar readings were unreliable. Birds, waves, or weather could all create false signals. The filter room, staffed by mathematically skilled officers and waifs, maintained a master plot of all sightings. When a new report arrived, they compared it with existing data, used logic to decide if it was a real aircraft, and assigned it an identification number. Only confirmed tracks went forward into the command network. These verified tracks appeared almost instantly in the main operations room at Bentley Priory, a vast hall, dominated by a huge map of southern England and northern France. Around it stood WAF plotters wearing headsets, pushing colored markers across the map as updates came every 30 seconds. Each counter showed a raid's ID number, estimated size and height. Red markers represented enemy aircraft, blue for friendly fighters, and black for unknown contacts. Triangular tabs showed the age of each report. New plots had upright triangles, 2-minute-old ones had right angles, and anything older than 4 minutes had inverted triangles, signaling outdated data. Dowding and his senior controllers watched from a raised gallery above this living map, overseeing the constant flow of information and decisions. Their duty wasn't to... Control of individual interceptions was impossible due to communication delays, so Dowding focused on managing resources across Fighter Command's 4 groups. If radar showed large enemy formations assembling over Calais and threatening Kent, Dowding would alert No. 11 Group's commander, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, to prepare squadrons for takeoff. At the same time, he'd warn No. 12 Group's Trafford Lee-Mallory to ready reserves in case the attack pushed inland toward London or the Midlands. The detailed control of each interception took place one step lower, at the group operations rooms, which mirrored the main plotting system and received the same filtered radar data. Park's 11 Group headquarters at Uxbridge had its own famous operations room, later visited by Churchill, where he observed the battle firsthand. From there, senior controllers assigned sectors to handle specific incoming raids. Each fighter command sector, roughly a 40-mile area, contained several airfields and was responsible for defending its assigned airspace. Sector controllers worked from operations rooms at key airfields, watching another copy of the master map. When Group HQ ordered fighters to scramble, sector controllers could immediately see where the enemy was, since their map showed the same raid markers as the higher command. As fighters climbed from their airfields, ground staff updated blue markers on the map to show each squadron's position, based on radio calls from the formation leader. Controllers then guided the pilots using high-frequency radio, giving continuous updates. Tally-ho! Bandits at Angels 20, Vector 180. The system's first real test came on July 10, 1940, a date later recognized as the official start of the Battle of Britain. German formations appeared over the Channel, attacking British convoys. Goering's goal wasn't to destroy the ships, but to lure Fighter Command into combat. The logic was simple. RAF fighters would rise to defend the convoys, and German aircraft would destroy them over water, where downed British pilots couldn't be rescued. It was a war of attrition, and the Luftwaffe had the numbers. But Dowding refused to fall into that trap. When Chainholm detected raids forming over Cap Gris-Nez aimed at convoys, he ordered minimal responses, perhaps a single squadron to make a brief show, then retreat before being overwhelmed. Controllers sometimes watched enemy bombers circle over convoys for half an hour, while Dowding held his fighters on the ground. Avoiding wasteful battles, admirals raged in protest. Ships were bombed while fighters sat idle, and the Royal Navy demanded stronger air cover. Dowding remained firm. Every lost Hurricane or Spitfire meant one fewer plane and pilot available for the real fight to come. Fighter Command began the battle with about 640 operational aircraft against roughly 2,800 German planes, and Dowding knew the math ruled everything. Losing 50 fighters for a few thousand tons of cargo would leave Britain defenseless when invasion came. His system allowed him to choose when and where to fight, and he intended to use that advantage wisely, striking only when odds favored him. In early August, the Luftwaffe shifted tactics to attack the system itself. On August 12, 1940, Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers struck radar stations along the Kent coast. Ventnor Station on the Isle of Wight was hit hard, its towers twisted, buildings destroyed. Dover's Chainholm site also suffered major damage. German intelligence believed knocking out these radars would blind Britain's defenses and open holes for their raids to slip through unseen. They were half right. Ventnor was down for 11 days, leaving a 70-mile blind spot, but Dowding's network proved tougher than expected. The Observer Corps filled the gap, visually tracking raids once they crossed the coast. Engineers even set up temporary aerials to transmit fake radar signals, fooling German listeners into thinking Ventnor still worked. Most importantly, the filter room adapted, rerouting data from neighboring stations to maintain a degraded but working radar picture. The system bent under pressure, but never broke. Then came August 13, Adler Tag, or Eagle Day, when Goering launched his grand offensive to destroy Fighter Command completely. The Luftwaffe flew more than 1,400 sorties, hammering airfields across southern England. German intelligence believed they had identified Britain's key fighter bases, Manston, Hawking and Lympne. Bombs cratered runways, wrecked hangars and killed ground crews. From Germany's point of view, the strike seemed devastatingly successful. But their analysts had made a fatal mistake. They had targeted coastal airfields that weren't part of Dowding's main control system. Manston and Hawking were merely forward landing strips for damaged or refueling aircraft, not command centres. The true sector stations, Biggin Hill, Kenley, Northolt, where the real operations rooms managed the defence, were mostly untouched. The Luftwaffe had hit the wrong targets. The Luftwaffe was smashing shop windows while the machinery in the back room kept running. 2 days later, on August 15th, the Germans launched their largest single-day assault, 2,119 sorties against targets stretching from Newcastle to Portland. This time, bombers came from 3 directions at once, hoping to overwhelm British defences. Luftflotte 5 struck from Norway and Denmark, attacking northeast England, territory they wrongly believed to be beyond British fighter range. In Dowding's operations room, every squadron status was tracked with colour-coded markers, available ready in action, refueling or resting. This simple system revealed Dowding's greatest strength, the cold, mathematical logic of survival. While Churchill and his war cabinet spoke in terms of courage and defiance, Dowding thought in numbers, pilot fatigue, aircraft production, and the minimum force needed to make invasion impossible. His conclusions were often unpleasant. The most important example came months earlier, on May 16, 1940, when France was collapsing and Prime Minister Paul Reynaud begged Britain for more air support. Churchill, swept up in emotion, promised to send every fighter he could. Dowding heard this during an Air Ministry meeting and immediately demanded to speak before the War Cabinet. That same afternoon, he stood before Churchill and presented his case with precise calculations. Fighter Command, he explained, needed 52 squadrons to defend Britain. With fewer, the system would collapse under a German offensive. Britain then had only 39 squadrons, already 13 short. Churchill wanted stirring words. Dowding gave him a graph. It showed that at the current rate of losses, Fighter Command would cease to exist within weeks. Sending more fighters to France would not save the French. They were already lost. It would only ensure Britain's defeat too. Churchill, used to men who yielded under pressure, found Dowding's firmness infuriating. But the math was undeniable. That night, Dowding wrote a blunt letter to the Air Ministry. "I must request that, as a matter of paramount urgency, the Air Ministry decide what strength is to remain with Fighter Command for the defense of this country." Behind the formal language was an ultimatum. Dowding would resign before allowing Fighter Command to be destroyed by poor planning. Churchill yielded. No more fighters went to France. Now, in August 1940, the wisdom of that decision was becoming clear. The squadrons Dowding had refused to send were the same ones now intercepting raids over Kent and Sussex. Even so, the situation was critical. Fighter Command was losing planes almost as fast as factories could replace them. Between August 8 and 23, the RAF lost 106 fighters and produced 128, barely keeping even. The shortage of pilots was worse, 94 killed or badly injured, replaced by only about 60 new trainees. A squadron normally began the battle with around 20 pilots, but by mid-August, many were down to 14 or 15, flying 3 or 4 missions a day. Dowding introduced a rotation system that infuriated his more aggressive subordinates. After 2 weeks of heavy combat, squadrons were pulled from No. 11 Group's front line and sent north to rest. replaced by fresher units from number 12 or 13 Group. The big, exhausted squadron spent weeks training, replacements and recovering before returning south. Leigh-Mallory argued bitterly that this weakened 11 Group when full strength was most needed. Surely, he claimed, keeping experienced squadrons in the air was better. Dowding saw what Leigh-Mallory did not. Once pilots were exhausted, their effectiveness vanished. A squadron that had lost its veteran leaders and was flying purely on nerves contributed little but easy targets for German fighters. It was better to rest them, even if it meant temporary weakness, than to burn them out completely. Dowding was not fighting for one battle. He was managing fighter command for the next 50 or 60 days that would decide Britain's survival. Sunday, September 15, 1940, dawned with scattered clouds over southern England and an eerie calm. By mid-morning, chain-home radar stations picked up large enemy formations gathering over Pas-de-Calais, massive groups suggesting a decisive strike. At Fighter Command Headquarters, Dowding watched as the operations map filled with red markers representing enemy bombers escorted by fighters. The attacks came in waves, timed so that British planes landing to refuel after meeting the first wave would be on the ground when the next struck. At 11 Group headquarters in Uxbridge, Air Vice Marshal Park scrambled every available squadron. The vast, coordinated defense Dowding had spent 5 years perfecting was now facing its ultimate test. By 11:30 a.m., 23 squadrons were airborne. By 11:30 a.m., more than 250 British fighters, 23 squadrons, were in the air at once. The largest single concentration fighter command had ever managed. Park's sector controllers watched their plotting tables, directing squadrons with pinpoint accuracy using real-time data from the filter rooms. Spitfires from Biggin Hill intercepted bombers over Maidstone. Hurricanes from Kenley attacked their escorts, and north-wheeled squadrons caught another formation approaching London from the east. That morning, Winston Churchill happened to visit Park's operations room. From the viewing gallery above the great map table, he watched WEF plotters sliding coloured markers across southern England, tracking the unfolding battle. Each squadron was marked by a small light, green for ready, red for in combat, blue for returning to base. As the fight intensified, more and more lights turned red until the map glowed almost entirely crimson. Churchill turned to Park and quietly asked, "What reserves have we left?" Park's reply was simple and chilling. There are none. Yet despite that, the system held firm. German bombers, constantly harassed by British fighters along their route, were forced to scatter their payloads across wide areas of southern England. Many jettisoned bombs over open countryside just to escape. Those that pressed on toward London arrived disorganized and exhausted, their tight formations broken, their accuracy destroyed. Dowding's insistence on attacking enemy formations far from their targets had paid off. Most bombers never reached their aiming points. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was immense. Expecting a shattered enemy, German crews instead met fresh fighters at 20,000 feet, then more at 15,000, and still more climbing to intercept as they retreated. That afternoon, the Luftwaffe tried again, sending an even larger force, over 150 bombers escorted by hundreds of fighters. This time, Dowding coordinated not just 11 Group, but also brought in Leigh-Mallory's 12 Group squadrons from the north. Forming the massive big wing formation he had long promoted, 5 squadrons flying together. German aircrews, already shaken by the morning's fight, were stunned to see what looked like the entire RAF rising to meet them. Amid the chaos of dogfights, British pilots claimed 185 German aircraft destroyed. The real number was 56, still a significant victory, but the exaggerated reports mattered less than perception. To the Luftwaffe, it seemed as though they had faced hundreds more British fighters than intelligence had predicted. German pilots returned, claiming they'd fought 300 to 400 enemy aircraft, twice the number Park had actually deployed. This illusion was created by Dowding's network, which vectored multiple squadrons to different interception points. giving the impression of fighters everywhere at once. German intelligence had believed Fighter Command had only about 200 serviceable aircraft left. On September 15th, they were forced to admit that number was wrong. 2 days later, Hitler indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. Reports confirmed what the Luftwaffe's aircrews already knew. Fighter Command was far from defeated, and without air superiority, invasion was impossible. The Battle of Britain was not entirely over. The Luftwaffe continued its bombing campaign into the autumn, leading to the Blitz. But the threat of invasion had passed. Britain had survived, and Dowding's integrated system had proven its worth beyond doubt. His reward was dismissal. On November 17, 1940, barely 2 months after Fighter Command's greatest triumph, the Air Ministry informed Dowding that he was being replaced by Air Marshal Sholto Douglas, a protégé of Chief of the Air Staff Sir Charles Portal. Dowding was offered a minor liaison post in America, essentially an exile. The man who had saved Britain was removed with less than a day's notice, no ceremony, and no thanks from the institution he had served for 38 years. The betrayal had begun weeks earlier, even as the battle raged. On October 17th, the Air Ministry held a meeting supposedly to discuss tactics, but it became a platform for Dowding's critics. Air Vice Marshal Lee Mallory arrived with prepared notes attacking Dowding's cautious defense strategy. The so-called Big Wing controversy gave him ammunition. He argued that if his 12 group squadrons had been allowed to form large wings and engage earlier, German losses would have been much higher. He was supported by squadron leader Douglas Bader, a bold and outspoken pilot, who claimed Dowding's restraint had wasted opportunities to crush the Luftwaffe completely. But the criticism was misleading. Lee Mallory's Big Wing required time. 5 squadrons or 60 aircraft took up to 30 minutes to form up. By the time they reached altitude and flew south to meet the enemy, the bombers had often already struck and turned for home. In contrast, Park's 11 group squadrons scrambled quickly from nearby airfields, meeting the enemy before they reached London. Exactly as Dowding's system was designed to do, the Big Wing occasionally produced impressive results. But it was no substitute for Dowding's precision and discipline. It arrived too late to change his fate, serving more as a psychological gesture than a practical defense. But Lee Mallory had powerful friends. Sir Charles Portal, who became Chief of the Air Staff on October 25th, favored bold, attack-minded officers over Dowding's careful defensive approach. Sholto Douglas, too, had long argued for aggressive fighter sweeps over France, dismissing Dowding's strategy of waiting to repel attacks. The Air Ministry establishment had resented Dowding's independence for years. His relentless push for radar funding, refusal to waste fighters in France, and tendency to question orders irritated his superiors. Now, with the crisis past, they were ready to remove him. The official reason for Dowding's dismissal cited his age and a need for fresh leadership. He was 58 when the battle began, nearly 59 when dismissed, the very age critics had complained about before. But those same men hadn't dared replace him when Britain's survival was on the line. The real problem wasn't his age. It was his personality. Dowding was blunt, uncharismatic, convinced of his own judgment, and unwilling to play politics. He had made few allies, but many enemies, and war provided the perfect stage for those enemies to strike. His loyal subordinate, Keith Park, architect of 11 Group's defense, soon followed him into exile, reassigned to Training Command, a quiet dead end for one of the war's most brilliant commanders. Park was later sent to Malta, while Lee Mallory replaced him at 11 Group. Ironically, the officers who had won the Battle of Britain were sidelined, replaced by men who had criticized them from afar. Dowding spent the rest of the war in increasingly minor roles before retiring in 1942, receiving a peerage as Baron Dowding of Bentley Priory. The title felt more like a polite farewell than an honor. He devoted his later years to spiritualism, writing about life after death and attending séances, habits that confirmed to the Air Ministry that they had been right to retire him. The man who built the world's first integrated air defense system faded quietly into obscurity. While others took the credit, his vindication came slowly, built on years of operational records, post-war research, and captured German reports. These showed that Dowding had been right all along. The Luftwaffe was just a week from abandoning its offensive when Hitler called off the invasion. German bomber crews were demoralized, their losses unsustainable, around 4% per mission. And Göring's claims that the RAF had only 50 fighters left proved disastrously false. Had Dowding wasted his strength in early convoy battles or committed to massive, slow-moving formations, Fighter Command would likely have collapsed by early September. The brilliance of Dowding's system became even clearer as other nations tried to imitate it. In the Pacific, American air defenses struggled through 1942 and 1943 because they lacked the centralized coordination Dowding had perfected. Their radar stations could detect Japanese aircraft, but relaying that data to fighters and coordinating intercepts was painfully slow. Eventually, the U.S. Army Air Forces sent officers to Britain to study Fighter Command's operations rooms and copied the system for use in the Marianas and the Philippines. The Soviets faced similar problems early in the German invasion. Despite having radar and thousands of planes, they couldn't synchronize their defenses. Radar operators worked separately from controllers, information arrived too late, and German bombers attacked Soviet cities almost freely. Only in 1943 did they adopt a filtered plotting system modeled directly on Dowding's methods. By the Cold War, every serious air defense system in the world had adopted Dowding's principles: centralized early warning, filtered data, real-time plotting, and ground-controlled interception. NORAD, created in 1958, was essentially Dowding's system expanded to continental scale. Radar lines across the Arctic feeding data to vast command centers, where controllers watched digital screens instead of paper maps, but performed the same job. When Soviet bombers appeared, interceptors launched under precise ground direction, exactly as Dowding had envisioned 20 years earlier. Modern air defense networks, from Israel's Iron Dome to America's Aegis systems, are direct descendants of his innovations. The technology has evolved far beyond his time. Phased array radar, satellite tracking, and computer automation have replaced the human plotters of 1940, but the structure remains unmistakably his. Sensors detect threats, data flows to centralized control rooms, and interceptors are guided by informed controllers. Dowding would instantly recognize the idea, even if it now runs on microchips instead of manual plotting tables. Sir Hugh Dowding died on February 15, 1970, at the age of 87. He lived long enough to see his ideas form the foundation of global air defense. The Air Ministry once doubted that a 58-year-old man could protect Britain with untested technology. That same man ended up transforming the very nature of modern warfare